A white police officer, tall and aggressive, has stopped a black woman. She stands right on the sidewalk, trying to explain herself, but his voice is louder. People around her have started to stop, to watch. The looks on their faces are tense and judgmental. It would seem like a routine document check, but with each passing minute it becomes clearer, this is not just an arrest. The police officer is acting as if he is trying to humiliate her. Her voice is starting to shake, but she does not back down. "Hey, did you hear that? What did she do?" Voices from the crowd are heard. People have started filming the scene on their phones. But at that moment, the woman suddenly does something that makes the crowd freeze. "Now it's your turn." Friends, where are you watching this video from? What do you think about what's happening? This is a real story that shows how important it is not to remain indifferent. Write in the comments your opinion. What would you do in the place of this woman or passers-by? And, of course, if you are interested in what happens next, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Click on the like if you support justice. I wish you a pleasant viewing, and don't switch. The crowd on the streets of New York was seething. As always, people were rushing about their business, cars were making noise, someone was arguing with a taxi driver, and someone was walking in the park with a dog. It was hot, as if the sky itself hung over the city like a weight from which there was no escape. In this buzzing anthill, everyone's attention was suddenly drawn to what was happening at the entrance to a store on the corner. A white policeman was standing in front of a young black woman, shouting something in her face, his words cutting the air like a knife. "Do you think you can do whatever you want?" his voice boomed, causing a murmur of discontent among the passers-by. The woman stood motionless, her face calm, but there was a fire in her eyes that could not be missed. People began to stop, forming a circle around them, like in old films about duels. The policeman pressed his hand to his holster, as if to indicate who was in charge. He was broad-shouldered, with a cold gaze, as if his every step was accompanied by a sense of power. But the woman did not seem to be about to give him an inch. She was dressed simply, a light dress, her hair neatly pulled back into a bun. Her arms hung along her body, not clenched into fists, but the tension was felt in her every movement. "I have nothing to explain to you," she said quietly but firmly, raising her chin a little higher. Her words caused a new surge of anger in the officer. He stepped even closer to her, almost touching her shoulder, and began to speak louder so that everyone in the crowd could hear. "You have nothing to explain? You violated the order. You stood there and refused to obey. Do you think you can just walk down the street as you please? I am the law, and you will listen to me." His words cut her ears, but she did not look away. The gazes of the passers-by were also fixed on both of them. Some looked with curiosity, others with bewilderment. One of the black passers-by seemed to want to say something, but remained silent, looking down. Everyone knew that in a city like this, where thousands of such stories go unnoticed every day, one wrong move and you can end up on the ground, in handcuffs. But the woman did not give up. "I'm tired of listening to people like you," she said, her voice calm but hard as metal. "You think your form makes you better? Your words? But you're only human. Like me." The words seemed to knock the air out of the policeman's lungs. He frowned, his face turning red. At that moment, something snapped, as if all the tension in the street had become unbearable, like a tightrope about to snap. The crowd huddled around, people whispering quietly. Someone took out a phone and started filming. Someone looked around, expecting something more. The policeman stepped closer, his face so close to the woman's that she could smell his anger, his hot breath, thick with anger. He slowly pulled out his baton, playing with it in his hand as if deciding what to do next. The crowd froze, and time seemed to stand still. People didn't know where this was going, but each of them felt the tension growing. The phones continued to record, the camera recording every second. "You talk too much," the officer said through clenched teeth. "Do you think that because someone came up with this movement of yours a couple of years ago, you're all equal now? Forget it. The law is the law. And you," he waved his hand at the woman, his words bouncing off the walls like stones thrown into water, "you're just another." He stopped short, but his gaze said it all. contempt, disrespect, latent racism. The words he didn't say were louder than any words he'd ever said. The woman flinched, not from fear, but from the rage that was starting to flare up inside her. She took a step forward, breaking the unspoken rules of the street that told her to keep quiet and retreat. "I'm tired of people like you who think they can humiliate us in front of everyone and get away with it." Her voice was like a thunderclap, each syllable pounding into the chests of those around her. "You wear a uniform, but underneath it you're the same as everyone else who thinks our skin color is a death sentence. Do you expect me to bend over for you? Never." Her words echoed in the ears of those around her. Several people in the crowd, black men and women, began to slowly move closer, supporting her with their silent presence. Someone nodded to her, someone put a hand on the shoulder of a neighbor, indicating that they all felt the same. The policeman noticed. His face was twisted with anger, but now there was a shadow of fear in it as well. It felt like control was slipping from his hands. He was used to something else, silent fear, to everyone running away at the sight of him, to no one daring to look him in the eye. But here, on this hot street, under the gaze of dozens of cameras, he was confronted with something more than just a woman on the corner. He was confronted with an entire generation. He raised the club a little higher, as if he was going to strike, but he didn't. His eyes flashed with anger, mixed with uncertainty. "You think you'll change anything?" His voice was hollow, as if he was already beginning to doubt his actions. "These people of yours, they can't help you. The law is on my side." "The law is on your side?" the woman asked, and her voice took on a bitterness, as if every word brought pain. "The law? This law has protected people like you for centuries, not us. We are fighting for the right to simply breathe, to live. And you know what the worst thing is? Your strength is fear, the fear of those who remain silent. But we will not remain silent anymore." With each word she spoke, the crowd tightened around them. People gathered on the sidewalk began to chant, "We are not silent." It was quiet but rhythmic, like the pulse of the street, as if the very energy of the city had risen to defend the woman. The policeman, feeling that he was losing control, suddenly raised his baton, but his hand froze in midair. Something was holding him back, not physical force, but an invisible wall erected by the collective voice of those standing nearby. The crowd continued to chant, growing louder. People were no longer afraid. "You think this club is your strength?" The woman took a step forward, and now their faces were inches apart. "But our strength is the truth that we will no longer tolerate humiliation." The officer, without taking his eyes off her, took a step back. The policeman took a step back, his face dark with suppressed anger, but he could clearly feel the ground shifting beneath him. The crowd began to shift from foot to foot, the tension brewing in the air like a thunderstorm before a storm. Camera phones were trained on them. Everyone knew this moment would be shared on social media, that this footage would be part of something bigger than just a street fight. The woman looked at the policeman with the same cold determination, but there was no fear in her eyes. She was no longer afraid. "You won't win," he said, his voice hollow, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "Do you think these people will help you? They'll go away as soon as this is over, and you'll be left alone. The law will always find a way to put you in your place." "In place?" The woman stepped forward, and her voice, unlike his, was as hard as granite. "You don't understand, do you? I'm not alone. None of us are alone anymore. You think we can be broken, but every time one of us falls, the others rise." The cop gritted his teeth, his hands still clutching his baton, his fingers white with tension. He looked around the crowd as if seeking support, but saw only disgruntled faces. Even those who had been watching before were beginning to change. The black passers-by were no longer silent, and the white ones who had initially tried to look away were now standing nearby, their faces expressing something between alarm and sympathy. "You don't know what it's like," the woman continued, her voice ringing like a taut string. "You live in a world where you're told you're in charge, where you wear a uniform and think you can do whatever you want, but the truth is, your power is an illusion, and it's disappearing right now." The policeman chuckled, but his eyes couldn't hide the fear. It was almost tangible, the fear that he was losing power. The crowd around them was growing larger. People were starting to whisper. Someone was shouting, "Enough!" their voices merging into a single rhythm of protest. "You think I'm afraid of you?" The policeman finally broke the silence, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. You think you can change anything by standing here and screaming? I represent the law. I am order. You are fear. The woman nodded at his club. You don't protect people. You scare them. You think your uniform gives you the right to humiliate, to intimidate, but you don't control us anymore. The crowd became increasingly agitated. People began to shout words of support for the woman. The phrases freedom, justice, became louder and louder. With each shout, the policeman increasingly felt like he was losing control of the situation. His face, previously confident and powerful, now reflected confusion and bewilderment. He did not know what to do. The baton in his hand, which a few minutes ago seemed like an instrument of power, now looked like a sign of powerlessness. The woman took another step forward, leaving almost no space between them. She looked him straight in the eye, and he took a step back, as if by reflex. This is not order. This is chaos, created by your actions, she said, her voice low but audible to everyone in the crowd. You are not the law. You are a distortion of it. The law is meant to protect us all, and today, you cannot hide behind your form. The policeman, feeling that the situation was getting out of control, took another step back. For the first time in his life, he was faced not just with a crowd, but with an idea that was stronger than him. Cameras were pointed at him. His face began to flash across smartphone screens. Someone was already streaming everything that was happening online. He knew that he couldn't lose control, but he couldn't help himself. His hands were shaking, and the noise around him was growing, like a storm that was about to overwhelm him. I order you to step aside, he shouted, but his voice no longer had the confidence it had had at the beginning. It was the desperate cry of a man who knows he is losing power. Ordering, the woman grinned. You're not ordering anymore. You're listening, and if you don't want to listen to us, then you'll listen to the whole world, because today everyone will see who you really are. Her words were like a blow that left him defenseless. The crowd screamed even louder, and now there was no doubt, the situation had gotten out of his control. The crowd's screams grew louder, like the sound of an approaching storm. The people watching were no longer passive spectators. The energy of the street had shifted, and this was more than just a skirmish between a woman and a police officer. It was a moment when something had been awakened in the hearts of the people. Some of them were no longer just holding their phones. They were shouting, supporting the woman who stood before the powerful figure of the law who had suddenly become vulnerable. Stop humiliating us, someone from the crowd shouted. Enough violence, said a woman in a red jacket, standing in the front row. The crowd began to move closer, step by step, squeezing the policeman and the woman into a tight circle. The policeman looked back, his face twisted with uncertainty. There were no longer just onlookers. Everyone standing around felt like they were part of the story. Black men and women began to shout slogans that sounded like hammer blows on iron. Justice for all, and we are here to not be silent. Their voices merged into a protest rhythm, creating a powerful wave of resistance. Some people started raising their fists in the air, repeating the famous gesture of resistance, a symbol of strength and unity. This gesture, like fire, spread through the crowd, and now not only blacks, but also whites and people of other nationalities raised their fists, becoming part of this moment. One man, around 50 years old, with gray hair and a heavy gaze, stepped forward, breaking away from the crowd. His face showed the pain of years of silence. He spoke loudly, over the noise. I've seen it over and over again, and every time I kept quiet, but not today. His voice evoked a response from others. A murmur of agreement rose in the crowd, as if everyone found the strength to support this woman in her struggle. Another man, who looked to be in his 30s, raised his hand excitedly. It's not just about her, it's about all of us. How long will we tolerate this? At that moment, the woman standing in front of the police officer turned to the crowd. Her face was grateful, but in her eyes was what kept her there, a determination not to let this end be a simple story of violence and power. I'm not the only one standing here today, she said loudly, her voice as clear and pure as a bell. We're all here today. We're not just victims today. We're a force, and that force can't be taken away from us. The woman's words caused a real explosion of emotions. People began to applaud, chanting, "Freedom! We are here for the truth." The shouts grew louder, and the policeman could no longer drown them out. He tried to say something, but his voice was lost in the growing roar of the street. Some of the bystanders in the crowd began to stand in front of the police cars parked nearby, forming a human wall. They were no longer afraid. One young woman in a white t-shirt and black braids held up a sign she had pulled out of her bag, which read in large black letters, "We will not be broken." This simple slogan suddenly became a symbol of what was happening around her. The policeman, feeling like he was surrounded by a sea of people, cowered. His face went pale, and his eyes darted frantically from one group to another. He knew that if he made one wrong move now, the situation could get out of control. He looked again at the baton in his hand, but now it seemed completely useless. Someone from the crowd shouted, "You no longer represent the law, you represent fear." These words hit him harder than any blow could have. The policeman's gaze, which had been full of power and menace just a few minutes ago, was now empty. He understood that he was losing not only this conflict, he was losing control of himself, of the situation, of the city, which no longer wanted to remain silent. The crowd was no longer still. Its roar was growing louder. People were coming closer, many shouting the names of those who had been victims of police brutality, whose lives had been destroyed by the impunity of the system. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. The names sounded like heartbeats, rhythmic and powerful, making everyone who was there feel that this was not just a personal protest, this was a global challenge to the system. The policeman took a step back, tripping over the curb. His eyes darted to his colleague a little further away, but he seemed too stunned by what was happening. The crowd closed in tighter, pressing down on anyone who dared to resist. The crowd seemed to be merging into a single whole, like a living organism breathing anger and determination. People were moving closer, each step an unspoken demand for justice that had been denied them for so long. The policeman began to realize that he no longer had any real power in his hands. The uniform and the baton with which he had become accustomed to controlling the situation now looked like empty symbols in the eyes of this crowd. "Enough!" he shouted, but his voice was too weak against the growing noise. "I order you to disperse." But the crowd was no longer listening. All these people, whose lives were lived under the constant pressure of fear and inequality, suddenly felt that in this moment they were not just spectators, they were participants in an event that could change their lives, change the rules of the game. The woman who had been standing in front of him all this time now stepped even closer, her eyes darting in his direction, and her voice sounded like a clap of thunder, drowning out all other sounds. "You can't give orders anymore." Her words were like a bolt of lightning. "Today, you're a man like me. Without your uniform and your baton, you're nothing, and that's the truth you're afraid to admit." The policeman took another step back, his breathing ragged. He could no longer hide his panic. His eyes flashed with vulnerability, and everyone saw it. The people around him began shouting, "You have no power over us." Someone from the crowd, a man with a determined face and a raised fist, stepped forward and shouted, "She's right, we're not afraid of you anymore. What can you do? Arrest us all? We're not leaving." Others in the crowd began to echo him, and now it was no longer just a murmur of discontent, but a real roar of resistance. People's faces were ablaze with rage, but it was not blind rage, it was anger built up over years of humiliation and impunity. They could not back down now, with the cameras on them, with everyone seeing that this was not just an isolated incident, it was a symbol of deep, systemic oppression. "We won't leave," the crowd chanted rhythmically, their voices merging into a single roar that filled the street. Their cries vibrated in the air, and even the walls of the buildings seemed to shake from the force of their words. The policeman began looking around for backup, but the other officers watching the situation hesitated. They, too, had seen the situation spiral out of control, and they knew that any wrong move could lead to an explosion. More and more faces appeared in the crowd, people who had heard the cries of protest and were approaching the scene, each one carrying the same determination. Nearby, an elderly black man standing with a stick raised his hand and said loudly, "I will not remain silent anymore. My mother was silent, my father was silent, but I will not." His words, so full of pain and pride, stirred something deep within the crowd. It was the moment when everyone standing on that street realized that they would no longer retreat. A young girl with loose dreadlocks stepped forward, holding a sign that read, "Truth will never die," her face expressing absolute determination. "If you want to stop us," the woman standing in front of the policeman continued, her voice ringing like a bell, "you'll have to stop all of us, but you can't do that." She took another step forward, almost touching the policeman. He froze, his hand clutching his baton, but it was clear now that he couldn't hit her. That would be the beginning of the end. His world, where he was the power and the law, where his uniform and weapon gave him the right to do whatever he wanted, was crumbling before his eyes. "Do you understand?" the woman said quietly but clearly, her eyes meeting his. "You're not afraid of me, you're afraid of the truth." The crowd roared even louder. The cries of the people merged into one powerful demand: justice. It was a moment that could no longer be ignored, a moment when everyone realized that they were no longer victims, but a force that could not be suppressed. People began to move even closer, and now the policeman found himself in the very center of this human maelstrom, surrounded by people who were no longer afraid of him. Now he was the one who felt small and vulnerable. Through the noise and chaos, the voice of a young girl suddenly cut through the crowd. "They always think that we will forget, that we will retreat, but not today." Her words were taken up by others, and the cries of protest grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. It was the voice of a generation that had finally broken through the walls of silence and fear. The policeman retreated further and further, his face covered in beads of sweat. He no longer tried to hide his panic. Every step he took was labored, and his eyes wandered, as if he were looking for a way to escape. But there was no escape. The crowd was squeezing him in its rings, and he felt that he no longer had control over the situation or himself. "Get out!" someone from the crowd shouted, and the cry echoed down the street, filling every crack between people. "Get out!" others echoed. The policeman realized that he had nothing more to do here. Each step he took back was accompanied by a wave of new shouts. The crowd had defeated him without a single blow, without a single shot. He could no longer be a symbol of power. His power was destroyed by their voices. The crowd grew increasingly unyielding. People were no longer simply chanting slogans and shouting words of encouragement. They were creating a living wall that represented their determination not to give up. The policeman, realizing that his strength and status no longer mattered, tried to find a way out of the situation, but his every step was under surveillance. His every movement was tracked. Images played through his mind: how he had used his power in the past, how easily he could intimidate, how his words and actions could destroy lives. Now, these memories, these images, suddenly felt familiar. He felt like he had become the object of the same fear he had once inspired in others. "Get out!" he shouted again, but his voice was weak and detached from reality. He couldn't even hear his own words. The crowd did not respond to his commands. Instead, it became increasingly aggressive. People began to escalate their emotions, and their rhetoric became increasingly harsh. Someone in the crowd pulled out flyers with images of victims of racist aggression, such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and began distributing them among the crowd. Soon, the flyers filled the street, adorning it with the names of those who had suffered impunity and systemic oppression. These images became another symbol of the struggle. The policeman, surrounded by people, began to notice that the situation was getting out of control. He felt fear and panic overwhelm him. Several people began to appear around him, directly questioning him about his actions, asking questions about his past. This was the moment when his personal story became public knowledge. "What are you going to do?" the woman in the bright orange cloak asked, her voice full of accusations. "How can you live with yourself after what you did?" These words caused an emotional reaction in the crowd. Anger and hurt mixed with pain began to come out. People began to shout out the names of their loved ones who had suffered from police violence. Each cry was a reminder of the shadow that racism casts on society. Their voices now sounded like a bell ringing over the street, a reminder that they would not forget, that they would fight to the end. The policeman clenched his hands, his fingers red with tension. His gaze darted from face to face in the crowd, seeing only anger and determination. Some people began to show their hands, which they said had been abused by the police. The gesture became a symbol of their stand for the truth, and it only added fuel to the fire. The crowd continued to advance. A young woman, her face in focus on several cameras, held up a sign that read, "Our lives matter." She came close to the police officer, her voice a roar of anger. "We will not be afraid anymore. You have lost your power over us. Now we show you who really has power." The policeman, seeing how everything around him was becoming increasingly tense, tried to return to his car. He could no longer maintain his previous arrogance. Support officers began to appear around him, but their faces were also full of confusion. Each of them saw that the situation was getting out of control, and they all understood that any action they took could provoke even greater aggression. The crowd, seeing the policeman trying to retreat, did not stop. People began to block the street, creating barriers and obstacles to prevent him from leaving. They no longer believed in the promises that had once seemed like hope for change. Now their desire was simply to show that they would not remain silent and would not allow anyone to humiliate them again. "Look at him!" one of the demonstrators shouted. "He stands here as a symbol of our fear, as a symbol of the system that oppresses us." The crowd responded with cheers. Their voices grew louder, their anger more consuming. They were not only condemning the officer's actions, but also bringing to the fore the systemic racism and inequality that had plagued them for so long. No longer hidden, these issues were now visible, powerful, and urgent. The policeman, surrounded by many eyes, was forced to realize that he could no longer control the situation. His feelings of fear and anxiety were overwhelming him. Every new cry and every new gesture of the crowd indicated that they were not simply protesting, they were fighting for their human dignity and rights, which had been ignored for so long. And so, in this street hell, the policeman realized that he could do nothing to change what was happening. His place was taken not by mere protests, but by a determination that broke down barriers that seemed impassable. Every step he took was surrounded by a wall of determination, and he was just one small part of the enormous change that was now taking place on this street. The policeman, feeling trapped in this never-ending vortex of emotion and judgment, began to realize that his own defenses had disappeared. The crowd was becoming more determined with each passing moment, its anger and determination like a storm rushing toward the shore. People were surrounding him, creating a tight circle that gave him no opportunity to retreat. "What will you do?" the woman in the orange cloak shouted again. "How will you answer for all your actions?" The policeman looked at the woman's face, her eyes sparkling in the twilight, and realized that there was no way to answer that question. He tried to remain calm, but his hands were shaking, and it was no longer hidden from the eyes of those around him. The crowd, supported by words and actions, continued to create an increasingly loud rhythm of protest. Young people who had previously remained silent now showed their hands with bruises and scars, reminding us of the violence they had suffered. Each of their gestures, each statement was an answer to questions that had long remained unanswered. Suddenly, one of the demonstrators, armed with a megaphone, began to shout a call for action. His voice was as powerful as thunder in a storm. "We must show that they cannot scare us. We must make sure that everyone knows, this is not just an accident. This is the beginning of change." These words caused an explosion of agreement. People began to chant in rhythm, their voices merging into a powerful echo that filled the street. Buildings began to shake from these cries, and the policeman could no longer ignore the scale of what was happening. Meanwhile, another protester, a girl with long braids, approached the police officer with a sign that read, "Equality or Death." She raised it high above her head, showing her determination. "You thought you could just get rid of us?" she asked defiantly, her voice clear and loud. "We're here to make sure everyone hears us." The crowd responded with cheers. People who had been standing nearby began to climb onto the sidewalks, blocking the road. They were prepared for what was to come. Even those who had initially tried to avoid conflict now realized that this moment could change everything. People united in a single intent to show that they would not succumb to fear and oppression. The policeman looked around, realizing that he was surrounded not just by protesters, but by symbols of resistance and pain that had accumulated over years of oppression. His fear was becoming more and more tangible. He knew that his former position of power had been destroyed, and his every action was perceived as a reflection of systemic injustice. "We will not remain silent any longer," he said, feeling his voice tremble. "We want justice." But this recognition no longer mattered much. The crowd was consumed by its own sense of unity and determination. They knew that this moment was not just an accident, but an opportunity to change the future. The policeman could no longer hide his fear. He tried to find a way to escape, but all efforts were in vain. "We all see you here," someone from the crowd shouted, "and we see how afraid you are. We see how your power is falling apart before our eyes." At this point, surrounded by these cries and accusations, the policeman's feelings became unbearably painful. He could no longer see a way out, and his face turned white with fear. The crowd's cries grew louder and louder, and it was like a fire that gradually consumed all obstacles. The crowd began to block roads in a demonstrative manner, demanding that the policemen come out and answer all the charges. Their determination was evident in their actions, and it was not just anger, but a manifestation of a deep desire for justice, for change to come. At this critical moment, the policeman felt that his power, which he had once used to intimidate and humiliate, no longer existed. All his attempts to regain control were unsuccessful. His fear and depression became obvious, and he could no longer hide his own doubts and anxieties. The crowd was still chanting slogans and calls for change. They were united in their determination not to retreat, and their voices, like a sea, washed over the policeman, demonstrating that this day had become a landmark moment. They wanted to show that they were no longer afraid, that they would fight until the end, and that everyone would hear their voice. The police officer standing at the center of the storm was stunned. His sense of his place in the world changed forever. He realized that this protest wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever felt disenfranchised and oppressed by the system. And despite all his preparation, he couldn't stop the wave of change that was now rolling through the streets. The crowd, feeling its strength and determination, continued to grow. Its tension increased with each passing minute, and the policeman, surrounded by this growing pressure, felt increasingly isolated. People who had previously been mere observers now became active participants in this street drama. They moved forward, boldly defending their rights and protesting against injustice. Some in the crowd began recording the events on their phones, sharing the video on social media. The image quickly spread across the internet, spreading a wave of indignation far beyond the street. First there were comments and reposts, then calls for action. This made the events even more significant and large-scale. The media's prompt intervention provided an additional level of pressure on the authorities, and the policeman felt it. His radio began to broadcast messages that the situation was out of control. In response, additional officers began to arrive at the scene, but they, too, were unsure how to intervene. The approaching cars with their lights and sirens could not hide the fact that the police were no longer able to control the situation. The crowd, with no gaps left, continued to fill the space around the policeman. People began to talk among themselves, discussing plans and actions. It was decided to create a living corridor that would allow the demonstrators to express their demands directly and without obstacles. The young man in the gray hoodie, who had been silent until then, stepped forward and, approaching the policeman, said, "We need to make sure that these actions do not go unpunished. We want everyone to know that racism and violence will not go unpunished. We are not just protesting, we are demanding change." The crowd responded to his words with cries of support. With this mood, people began to create posters and signs that expressed specific demands for reforms in the police and society as a whole. One of the posters read, "We demand transparency and accountability." This became a symbol of their demands. At one point, noticing that the police are starting to panic, one of the police commanders stands in front of the crowd and tries to establish contact. He raises his hands to show his willingness to negotiate. "We hear you," he says, his voice audible over the noise. "Let's discuss how we can resolve this situation." The crowd quiets down a bit, allowing the commander to speak, but they remain wary. A woman who was in the front rows replies, "We are not just discussing this. We want to see real change. We need the system to work for us, not against us." Meanwhile, several groups of people appear among the crowd and begin to organize the distribution of water and food to support the protesters, knowing that they may be on the streets for a long time. These groups also monitor that no action turns violent or destructive. Observing this, the police officers who arrived later noticed that the demonstration had an organized character. They began to carefully approach the crowd to establish communication and try to relieve tension. The commanders' faces showed that they were trying to take into account the demands and moods of the protesters as much as possible. However, the tensions did not completely disappear. One of the new police officers who was sent to manage the situation noticed that people still felt deeply hurt. He slowly and carefully approached one group of protesters and, using de-escalation tactics, began a conversation. "We understand that you want change. We are ready to listen to your proposals. Tell us how you see the way forward." These words, although sincere, are set against a backdrop of deep mistrust. People look at the officer with caution, realizing that words must be backed up by actions. Some begin to voice specific proposals, such as improving internal police control processes, creating independent commissions to investigate complaints about law enforcement, and changing police tactics. Demands are becoming clear and concrete, and protesters are beginning to realize that this moment can be used to achieve real change. People continue to support each other, setting internal boundaries and rules to keep the protest peaceful. The police officer in the spotlight realized that his situation had become a symbol not only of personal responsibility, but of a larger problem that required a holistic approach and a willingness to change. He felt he was faced with a difficult choice: either continue to stand in his defensive position and become a symbol of resistance to the system, or work to make that resistance a catalyst for change. With each passing minute, the protest became more structured, and at the same time more insistent in its demands. The demonstrators remained vigilant and focused, ready to fight for their rights until the end, until their demands were met. The crowd gradually calmed down, creating space for negotiations, but at the center of the conflict remained a key figure, the black woman with whom the officer had clashed. Her eyes were blazing with determination, and her position in the spotlight became a symbol of the entire struggle for justice. Now that the protest had become more organized, attention was once again focused on her interaction with the officer. The police commander, seeing that tensions between the officer and the woman remained high, decided to send a team of negotiators to them. These officers were trained in conflict management and were supposed to help resolve the situation. When approaching the woman, they tried to act carefully and respectfully. "We want to get to the bottom of this," one of the negotiators began. "We understand that what happened was wrong. Please tell us what you want to see as a solution." The woman standing in front of the policeman was obviously tired, but her eyes were determined. She stood with her head up, her face reflecting the emotions that had been built up over years of struggle and humiliation. She began to speak, her voice calm but firm. "My demands are simple," she said. "I want you to acknowledge that systemic racism exists and that it must be eradicated. I want cases like mine to not go unpunished. We demand transparency in police actions and fair investigations into all incidents of violence." The police officer who was at the center of this conflict began to realize that the pressure was mounting. He was standing opposite the woman, and the conflict that had unfolded that day was being recreated between them. Trying to control his emotions, he turned to her. "I understand how you feel. We all see that the situation has become very tense, but in order to change the situation, we need to discuss it calmly. What are the specific steps you want us to take?" The woman turned to face him, her eyes full of determination. "Calm talk is good, but it will not solve the problem. We have seen that promises were made, but they were often left unfulfilled. We need concrete measures. We want to see that you really change your policies, that you create independent commissions that will monitor the actions of the police and conduct thorough investigations." The crowd standing nearby supported her words with cheers and applause. They were ready to support her in this conflict and continue the fight for change. The police commander, observing the tense situation, realized that the confrontation between the woman and the officer could escalate if not resolved. He intervened to try to steer the conversation in a more constructive direction. "Let's gather your demands and submit them for consideration. We are ready to review them and discuss how changes can be made. It will not be a quick process, but we are committed to working on it." The woman looked at him doubtfully, but she could see that he was genuinely interested in finding solutions. She knew that this proposal could be the first step toward change, but she also knew that she had to be careful. "I'm willing to consider this proposal," she said, "but only if we see real change. We won't leave until we see your words turn into actions." With that, she turned back to the crowd, who responded with delight. People began discussing next steps, realizing that this could be a turning point in their fight. The crowd was still on edge, watching the situation unfold. Attention was focused on the policeman and the woman, and everyone understood that much could depend on this meeting. Every step that was taken, every new conversation, was a potential step toward real change. The policeman, seeing that the tension between him and the woman was not going away, felt that his own actions and words would now have long-term consequences. He understood that he and his colleagues would be under pressure until the protesters' demands were met. Meanwhile, journalists who continued to cover the events began to notice new details: interviews with protesters, reports on negotiations, and reactions from citizens. This coverage was important because it increased pressure on the authorities and drew public attention to important issues. Every new step, every new proposal, every conflict was part of a larger process. The police and the protesters were in a state where every action could either worsen the conflict or lead to a decision that could change the situation radically. The situation remained tense, but there was also hope that the conversations that had begun would lead to concrete and fair changes. As the conversation between the woman and the police officer continued, The tension in the air felt like physical pressure. The crowd, despite the negotiators' attempts to ease the tension, continued to support her. Their demands and emotions, anger and determination were intertwined with hope for change. Every moment was filled with anticipation, and every move of the police and protesters was carefully watched. The police officer at the center of the conflict tried to maintain his composure, but the tension on his face was visible. He knew that his every word would be carefully weighed and analyzed. As if in response to his internal stress, his team began to show signs of confusion. The officers who were supposed to be helping with the negotiations looked worried and overwhelmed by the situation. The woman, with an expression of determination, addressed not only the policeman, but also the assembled crowd. She raised her voice to convey her demands to as many people as possible. Her words were full of pain and disappointment. She spoke of personal experiences and feelings that were so deep that they seemed almost inexpressible. "We're not just asking for change," she continued. "We're demanding it. We're demanding that everyone who wears a uniform understands that their actions have consequences. We're demanding justice that's not just words on paper, but real action that touches the lives of every single one of us." The crowd responded with thunderous applause and cheers. People gathered around her began to repeat her words, creating a powerful chorus of protesting voices. It was like a collective demand, expressed in one powerful and decisive chord. The police officer, realizing that the situation was on the verge of getting out of control, began to look around for support and a solution. He saw that the commander and other officers were trying to take steps to de-escalate, but every step was like ice. Any wrong move could lead to new outbursts of anger. The police commander, who was trying to control the situation, approached the woman and tried to calm her down. His voice was quiet and calm, but there was a clear note of tension in it. "We are ready to listen to your proposals and consider them seriously, but we ask that you give us time to analyze and work out your demands." The woman, seeing his efforts but remaining wary, replied, "Time is something we don't have. We've waited too long already. If we don't see concrete actions and real change, all of this will be empty promises." At this point, other authorities and local officials began to approach the police. They realized that the situation required a careful and sensitive approach. At the same time, due to the tension and prolonged conflict, both the protesters and the police began to show signs of fatigue. This necessitated a quick response to prevent further escalation. A local official proposed a plan for a temporary truce to hold a meeting with representatives of the protesters and the authorities to discuss demands and come up with a plan of action, but the proposal was met with caution. The protesters wanted to see real steps, not just more discussions that might not lead to results. While this agreement was being discussed, local activists began to sort out the protesters' internal affairs, who would represent them, what demands would be made officially, and how to organize follow-up actions if their demands were not met. Police, for their part, have tried to improve communication and prepare to respond to possible new outbursts of anger. They have begun working to create a more transparent system of reporting and interaction with citizens. Some officers have begun to openly discuss the need for reform with protesters, demonstrating a willingness to change. At this critical moment, when it seemed that the conflict could escalate into new violence, the most important step was to establish a clear and constructive dialogue. The crowd remained in place, expecting actions to follow words, and the protesters continued to control the situation, not allowing it to get out of control. Now all attention was focused on keeping the protests peaceful and achieving real change. Every step and every word became significant in this process, and both the police and the protesters understood the importance of this moment for the future developments. While the internal negotiations continued, the situation on the street remained tense. The crowd, although filled with a certain sense of hope due to the offer of a temporary truce, did not let down its guard. The anticipation and tension continued to mount, and time became a major factor in this street drama. Local officials, seeking to demonstrate their commitment to real change, arranged a meeting with representatives of the protesters. They offered a space near the scene to hold talks. The protesters' representatives selected several of the most vocal and prominent individuals who could represent their interests and ensure that their demands would be heard. When the delegation of protesters entered the negotiating room, they were confronted by police and local officials. One of the women in the delegation, an activist named Lena, began the meeting by addressing the officials. "We did not come here to discuss general phrases and promises. We came to see real actions and change the system that has long supported racism and injustice. One local official, seeing Lena's determination, proposed concrete steps. He proposed creating a task force to investigate incidents like the one involving the woman at the center of the conflict. The task force would include independent experts, representatives of human rights organizations, and community leaders. The idea of introducing mandatory training for police officers on racial profiling and social justice was also proposed. Lena and her colleagues were cautious, but acknowledged that these proposals could become the basis for change. They demanded clear deadlines and mechanisms for monitoring the fulfillment of promises. "We are ready to work with you on these proposals," Lena said, "but only if we have the opportunity to monitor implementation and ensure transparency at every stage. We cannot allow these promises to remain just on paper." Local authorities agreed to this. They proposed to create an official committee to monitor the implementation of the proposals and to schedule regular reports on the progress of the reforms. Meanwhile, the demonstration continued outside. People continued to support the protesters, demanding change and capturing the moments on camera. Videos and photos began to spread across social media, showing how society was actively supporting the fight for justice. Against this backdrop, the police officer who had previously been at the center of the conflict also faced internal challenges. His colleagues and commanders began asking questions about how to prevent similar incidents in the future. He had to discuss his actions and acknowledge that changes in police tactics and training were needed. When a delegation of protesters returned to the crowd, they reported the agreements that had been reached. The announcement provoked a mixed reaction. Protesters were pleased that the talks had led to concrete proposals, but remained wary and demanded that words be backed up by action. The woman who was the center of attention at the beginning of the conflict addressed the crowd. "We have taken a step forward, but this is only the beginning. We must remain vigilant and watch how these promises are realized. Our fight continues until true justice is achieved." The crowd greeted her words with applause and cheers. People began planning their next steps to ensure that change would actually happen. At this time, police officers also began discussing how to better engage with the community and what could be done to prevent such conflicts in the future. However, the real challenge was to maintain and develop the dialogue and actively work to implement the proposed reforms. It was important to ensure that the working groups and committees that were created actually fulfilled their obligations and that residents could see real changes. The conflict on the street had reached its climax, but the remaining questions and the need for further action meant that the story was not yet over. Both protesters and authorities were now in a state of expectation and anticipation, knowing that their combined efforts would determine what the future would look like. After the delegation of protesters returned to the crowd with news of the agreements reached, attention again focused on the woman who had become a symbol of the conflict. There was a tired but determined look in her eyes, and she knew that her actions at this moment could have a significant impact on the future course of events. As the policeman approached her, she looked at him with an indescribable mixture of anger and hope. She was still under the influence of the heated discussion and negotiations, but her attention was focused on ensuring that her demands were not forgotten. "We've made progress, but we're not done," she told the officer, her voice stern but measured. "I expect you to work to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. This should be the beginning of change, not just an empty promise." The policeman, seeing the determination in her eyes and realizing that the situation required him to act, nodded. He realized that simply being part of a system that could be changed was not enough. He decided that his actions had to demonstrate respect and a desire for change. "I understand," he said. "We all have to work to improve this system. I will do everything I can to support change and to act so that situations like this never happen again." The woman looked at him, as if trying to read his sincerity. She knew that his promise alone would not change the system, but she also understood that this very moment could be the beginning of something new. She took a step toward him and extended her hand. "I hope your words are backed by action," she said, her voice softening slightly. "We'll be monitoring this and holding it accountable. It's our way of ensuring that change actually happens." The policeman, taking her hand, felt an added responsibility. It was more than just a political commitment. It was a personal recognition of the importance of change and the need to maintain public trust. He nodded in response and said, "I will try to do everything in my power to ensure that this promise is fulfilled. We must all work on this together." The crowd watching their interaction reacted to this moment with relief. The protesters began to put down their signs and gather, but their resolve remained unwavering. People continued to discuss upcoming actions and form plans to observe how the agreements would be implemented. Meanwhile, local officials and community representatives began preparing for the next step, creating a working group and developing a plan to implement the reforms. They understood that concrete work and long-term efforts were now required to ensure that the agreements were implemented. The woman, watching as people around her began to organize and plan their next steps, felt some satisfaction in what had been accomplished, but also knew that there was much work to be done. She went home knowing that her struggle had become a symbol of a larger movement that required her energy and effort. The policeman, returning to his colleagues, knew that this night had become a turning point not only for him, but for the entire system. He knew that reform would not be easy, but he understood the importance of honesty and a willingness to change. Several weeks passed, and the working group's work began to bear fruit. Specific recommendations for improving police interactions with the community were developed, and the first steps toward changing internal policies were made. Protesters continued to monitor the process and actively participate in the discussions to ensure that the reforms did not remain just on paper. What began as a tragic conflict gradually evolved into a platform for discussion and change. It was a reminder that every action and every demand matters, and that the fight for justice can lead to real change if everyone is willing to work together. As time passed, the tension and anticipation began to subside, but the reforms that had been proposed as a result of that contentious day were still in the spotlight. The police officer at the center of the events knew that he had a long way to go to rebuild trust and back up his words with action. He knew that it would not be an easy task, and that every step of his work would be closely monitored and judged by the public. In order to prove his sincerity and back up his promises, the police officer began to take several important steps. He decided that one of the first steps would be to engage openly and honestly with the community. The police officer initiated a series of meetings with local community representatives, activists, and human rights defenders. At these meetings, he shared his experience, explaining what changes would be introduced into police practice and how interaction with the population was planned to improve. He actively listened to suggestions and comments, trying to demonstrate a willingness to engage in dialogue. One of the key steps was to implement a training program for police officers. The officer insisted that the course include training on racial profiling, discrimination, and conflict resolution. He also supported the idea of including real-life stories and cases in the training so that officers could better understand the impact of their actions on society. The police officer also worked hard to establish an independent committee to oversee the implementation of the proposed reforms. This committee included representatives from various social strata, such as community organizations, local activists, and even those who had previously criticized the police. The committee was given the authority to review and evaluate the police and to provide regular reports on the progress of the reforms. One of the important steps the officer took was to create open forums for discussing concerns and suggestions. These forums provided residents with an opportunity to directly express their concerns, share experiences, and suggest ideas for improving law enforcement. The officer actively participated in these forums, asking questions, listening to feedback, and responding to criticism. But the most important thing about his approach was that he tried to be approachable and open. The policeman began regularly attending community events organized by local groups and participating in public discussions. He tried to show that he was not just a representative of the system, but also a person who genuinely wanted to improve the situation. Several months passed and the results began to show. New policies and protocols were put in place based on community feedback. The first signs of improvement in the interactions between the police and the community began to appear. The police began to show more understanding and tolerance in their actions, and improved communication became noticeable in their work. Local news stories began to highlight the positive changes, and this brought some relief. People began to see that the reforms were actually working, and that the police were becoming more open to interaction with the public. The officer who had started this journey continued to be at the forefront of change, and his efforts began to be recognized. However, the policeman knew that the real test would come when the reforms were put to the test in real-life situations. He knew that every mistake or oversight could call into question the results achieved, and that his job would never be done. Constant evaluation, openness, and a willingness to improve remained key to maintaining public trust and confidence. The woman who became the symbol of the conflict also noticed the changes and expressed her opinions. She continued to follow the process and participate in public discussions. Although she was wary and understood that reforms take time, she began to notice positive changes and acknowledge the efforts made to achieve justice. Every step that was taken proved that reform was not just a lip service, but a real process of change. It was proof that when the community and law enforcement work together, significant change can be achieved and a fairer system can be created for all. As time went on, the officer and his colleagues continued to work on implementing reforms, and real changes could be seen in their actions. The public followed every step and became noticeably more involved in the life of their community, which also contributed to improving relations between the police and citizens. Periodic media coverage continued to document changes in policing practices and community engagement. Journalists highlighted positive examples of successful interactions between police and local residents, as well as events where police officers participated in community initiatives and events. One of these activities was cooperation with local schools and youth organizations. Police officers began to conduct educational programs and trainings for teenagers to increase their awareness of the law, legal rights and responsibilities, and to develop trust in law enforcement. The police officer who was initially at the center of the conflict became the face of these programs and often attended the events, interacting with young people and answering their questions. At one such event, held at a local high school, the police officer addressed the students with a speech that reflected his internal changes and understanding of the importance of his job. "I am here to tell you that my work and actions are not just words. We are working to change the system and make it more fair. I hope that our actions will help you understand that we are here to serve and protect you, not just to fulfill our duties." The students, observing the police officer's sincerity, began asking questions about reforms and changes. The police officer responded to each question with respect, trying to demonstrate his commitment to change and understanding of the problems faced by young people. These meetings helped to build trust between police officers and young people and contributed to a more positive image of law enforcement. Meanwhile, the task force and the independent committee continued their work. They published reports on the implementation of the reforms, identifying both successful steps and areas requiring further attention. Citizens began to notice improvements in policing practices, and many of them became actively involved in discussions and proposals for further improvements to policing. On one such day, when the policeman met again with the woman who had become a symbol of the fight for justice at the beginning of the conflict, he noticed that her attitude towards him had changed. The woman, although still critical, acknowledged that the reforms had begun to bear fruit. "I see that you and your team are really working to make changes," she told the officer. "That doesn't mean everything is perfect, but there are visible improvements. Keep moving forward and remember that your success depends on consistent effort and honesty." The officer nodded, taking her words into account. He understood that his job was not finished, and that he needed to continue working to maintain and improve the changes that had been implemented. He also understood that scrutiny of his actions and those of his colleagues would continue, and that it was important to remain open to criticism. As time went on, the community atmosphere became more positive. Citizens began to see real improvements in police work, and more people began to trust law enforcement. Protesters and activists continued to play an important role in ensuring transparency and accountability, but the overall climate became more constructive. What once began as a conflict became an example of how social movements and law enforcement can work together to create real change. The police officer who faced the conflict and became a symbol of the fight for reform continued his work, knowing that every step and every action he took mattered in shaping the future. What began as a tense incident on the street turned into a story of successful collaboration and progress. It was a reminder that change is possible when everyone is willing to work together for the common good, and that every action taken to improve can be a step toward a more just and inclusive society. Over time, despite efforts to reform police practices and improve relations between law enforcement and the community, questions about the consequences for those directly involved in the conflict continued to linger. The officer at the center of the initial incident recognized that his actions had caused significant public outcry and understood that the question of punishment was also part of the process necessary to restore justice. Although he had taken a number of steps to demonstrate his sincerity and commitment to reform, it was important to understand how his own conduct would be judged in light of the new changes. To this end, An independent commission was appointed to look at specific incidents and actions, including that of the officer in question, and to assess whether disciplinary action was necessary. The commission was established through a transparent and open process to ensure objectivity and fairness. It included lawyers, representatives of human rights organizations, and independent experts. They began their investigation by carefully examining all materials related to the incident, as well as new information about how the police officer carried out his duties in the aftermath. During the investigation, the commission interviewed witnesses, including the police officers who were at the scene of the incident, as well as community members who observed the incident. Particular attention was paid to analyzing the actions of the officer in the context of his interaction with the woman in compliance with internal police protocols. Although the officer made efforts to correct the situation and engage in reform, the investigation found that his actions during the incident breached several key standards of professional ethics and conduct. In particular, it was highlighted that his approach to the woman was excessive and did not meet the expected level of respect and professionalism. Following the investigation, the commission concluded that a disciplinary sanction was necessary. This sanction had to reflect the seriousness of the violations, but also take into account the fact that the officer had demonstrated a willingness to cooperate and improve. The commission's decision included several key aspects. 1. Restriction of authority. The officer was temporarily removed from active duty and placed on administrative duty for 6 months. This allowed him to focus on training and rehabilitation, as well as continue to participate in reform efforts. 2. Mandatory training. The officer was required to undergo additional training on racial profiling, conflict resolution, and ethical behavior. This training was intended to help him understand how his actions impact public perception and how to properly interact with citizens. 3. Notes in the personnel file. There were comments in his personnel file that indicated serious violations in his work. These comments could affect his career prospects and opportunities for advancement in the future. 4. Community service. The officer was required to participate in community projects aimed at building trust between the police and the community. This included volunteer work and participation in programs that would improve relations with the community. For some in the public, the commission's decision was a step in the right direction. It demonstrated that even those at the center of the system are not immune from consequences for their actions. It also underscored the importance of transparency and fairness in decision-making. However, not everyone was satisfied with the results. Some activists felt that the punishments were not severe enough and did not reflect the full gravity of the violations. They continued to insist on the need for further reforms and improvements in the justice system. The police officer who faced disciplinary action accepted his punishment with understanding. He realized that his actions at the beginning of the process were an important lesson that helped him and others learn valuable lessons. He continued to work on himself, striving to prove his commitment to improvement and change in the system. Ultimately, the process of punishment and reform became part of a larger picture of changes taking place in law enforcement. It was an important step toward creating a fairer and more transparent system that sought to take into account the interests and rights of every citizen. The incident and subsequent investigation changed the police officer's life dramatically. The day he found himself in the middle of a conflict was a turning point not only for him, but also for his career and personal life. Every subsequent decision and action was in the public eye, requiring him to work hard to restore his reputation and implement the changes he had promised. The officer was transferred to administrative work, which meant losing the operational work he once considered the core of his job. In his new role, his tasks included processing paperwork, organizing training sessions, and helping to develop new police policies. The job gave him time for self-reflection and learning. He was involved in creating and implementing new policies aimed at preventing incidents like the woman's from happening again. This allowed him to gain a deeper understanding of the system's internal problems and contribute to improving its functions. The officer embraced mandatory training as a chance to change his behavior and approaches. Racial profiling and conflict resolution courses became key elements of his work. He found that these trainings not only helped him better understand the social and cultural aspects of his job, but also became an important part of his personal development. Some trainings were particularly challenging because they forced him to confront his own biases and behavioral shortcomings. He participated in role plays and simulations that focused on developing empathy and communication skills. These trainings also included discussions of real-life cases, which allowed him to better understand the impact of his actions on citizens. Community service became an important part of his new life. The police officer began to actively participate in various community projects and initiatives aimed at improving relations between the police and local residents. He conducted lessons and events in schools, participated in community forums, and helped organize events to create mutual understanding. One day, during one of these events, he met with the woman who had been involved in the incident. It was a difficult and emotional meeting, but it allowed him to express his apologies and thank her for being a catalyst for change. The woman, although wary, recognized that his efforts and involvement in the community were important steps forward. On the career front, the policeman faced two major consequences. Firstly, his promotions were suspended and his career opportunities were limited for some time. This was a big blow to his ambitions, but he understood that it was a deserved punishment. Secondly, his personal life also underwent changes. He began to devote more time to his family and loved ones, realizing that his work and career should not be the only priorities. He became more open and attentive to his loved ones, which helped strengthen their relationships and create a more harmonious atmosphere at home. Over time, the officer began to notice that his efforts to improve himself and change his behavior were beginning to bear fruit. He began to treat citizens with more respect and resolve conflicts more effectively. He also noticed that his colleagues began to perceive him more positively, which contributed to an improved work environment. Gradually, he began to return to more active service, but now his actions were under stricter supervision. He used the knowledge and experience gained during reforms and training to help colleagues in their work and maintain a high level of professionalism in the department. The police officer continued to maintain an open dialogue with the public and remained involved in reform processes, understanding that this was not just his job, but a responsibility he had taken on. He became part of a wider campaign to improve relations between the police and the community, and his personal story became an inspiring example of how to overcome difficulties and become a better person. Thus, the policeman's life changed significantly after the incident. He went from public condemnation and disciplinary punishment to active participation in reforming the system and improving his professional performance. This process was difficult and full of challenges, but it became an important part of his life and career, shaping him as a more responsible and attentive person to others. The life of the black woman who became a symbol of the conflict also changed after the incident. She faced many challenges, but also found opportunities to grow and actively participate in social change. After the incident, her life changed dramatically. First, she found herself in the public eye, which brought her both support and criticism. She became a symbol of the fight for justice, which brought her to the attention of the media and the public. This was both a blessing and a burden. Her visibility led to her becoming a prominent voice in the discussions about law enforcement reform. She began receiving invitations to participate in public forums, discussions, and press conferences where she could share her experiences and advocate for change. This activism gave her a platform to express her views and support others facing similar challenges. However, with this came new challenges. The public attention and pressure had a strong impact on her personal life. Her family and loved ones also had to deal with the consequences of public attention and pressure. This required her to find a balance between being active in public life and maintaining her personal life. The woman became actively involved in community organizations and initiatives aimed at improving conditions for black communities and combating systemic racism. She collaborated with advocacy groups, helping to develop new programs and policies aimed at improving relations between the police and local residents. Her own experiences became a valuable contribution to the work of these organizations. She also began working on educational initiatives to raise awareness of racial injustice and create opportunities for youth. She gave lectures and trainings, sharing her experiences and inspiring others to fight for their rights and justice. In her personal life, she also began to seek out ways to help herself and recover. Psychological support and therapy became important aspects of her life, helping her cope with the effects of stress and trauma she had experienced. These resources helped her maintain emotional health and find the strength to continue her social activities. Her experience also led to personal growth and change. She became more confident in herself and her ability to influence the world around her. Despite the challenges, she learned to use her platform to create positive change and inspire others to take action. Over time, the woman's life took on new meaning and purpose. She used her story and experiences to help others, improve social conditions, and promote justice. This transformation allowed her to become not only a symbol of the struggle, but also an active participant in creating the changes she once dreamed of seeing. The woman continued to work to ensure that her experiences and actions brought real benefits to society. She became part of a larger movement for justice and equality, and her personal story became an important example of how opportunities for significant change and improvement can emerge from difficult situations. As time went on, the woman's life entered a new phase. After months of active social activism and personal transformation, she began to notice how her efforts were bearing real fruit. New programs and initiatives in which she participated began to help many people, and her work began to be perceived as an important part of the overall movement for change. In her home area, the relationship between the police and the local community has improved significantly. Based on her experience and work, new education programs and training for police officers have been implemented, which has helped reduce tensions and improve mutual understanding. She has received gratitude and support from the community, which has helped her stay motivated and continue her work. Personal recovery also became an important part of her life. She continued to practice self-help and maintain contact with therapists, which helped her cope with the emotional consequences of the incident and the stress. Psychological support allowed her to find inner balance and maintain a positive attitude towards her activities. Her relationships with her family and loved ones have strengthened. After the stress and strain of being in the public eye, she has found more time for her loved ones. This has helped restore harmony in her personal life and create the support she needs to continue her work. In the final stages of her activism for social change, she decided to focus on long-term goals. She began working on creating a foundation that would continue to support education and outreach programs for communities facing racial injustice. The foundation became her way of leaving lasting legacy and make a lasting contribution to the fight for justice. Gradually, the woman's life entered a more stable course. She continued to be active in public life, but without the same level of tension. Her work to reform and improve relations between the police and the community became part of her legacy. The woman was able to not only change her life, but also make a significant contribution to social change, leaving a mark on the hearts and minds of those who strive for justice and equality. What began as a confrontational incident ends as an example of resilience and the possibility of change. The woman who became a symbol of the fight for justice and the police officer who faced the consequences of his actions have both come a long way. Their experiences and efforts have led to real change in society and improved relations between the police and the community. The woman used her platform to inspire and support others, actively working to create new opportunities and reforms. The cop, who experienced punishment and self-improvement, became part of the process of change in the law enforcement system. Together, they demonstrated how personal hardships can lead to meaningful social change. Their stories intersected, leaving behind a trail that continues to inspire and motivate. This story shows that even the most difficult challenges can become a starting point for positive change if people are willing to work on themselves and fight for justice. We would like to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about how it unfolded and how it ended? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? If so, please share your story in the comments. We really value your experiences and opinions. Your opinion is of great importance to us, and we value every thought and comment. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell to stay up to date with news stories and updates. Your participation helps us create content that really matters. Thank you for being with us.